Hey everyone, and welcome to this episode of CoCast. With me today is my co-host Rasmus. How are you today, Rasmus? Your voice is a bit scrawlier, I heard.
Yeah, it's I'm a bit tired today actually, but I want us to do this every week. So I'll just have to try and see if my thoughts come out coherently in what we're going to discuss. But yeah, I mean, I love doing this. I'm really happy we've started doing this continuously. It's a fun kind of creative moment every week to just get together and sort of talk about all the things we think about and have thought about for a long time. How are you doing?
I'm good. I've had a tremendous week. A lot of flow state moments happening both on and off work. It's been a really good week for me.
Cool. Do you have anyone to share? Any moment to share?
I think the meeting I already shared yesterday with me and Henrik was an awesome feeling of just having an eye opener of how much more we are aligned when we actually communicate uh, than expected.
Yeah, I
But
thought that was
so
I thought that was pretty interesting actually, just because it was sort of like uh, almost like an illusion of misalignment. You know what I mean? It's like
mm,
almost like, at least from my point of view, I'd sensed like a little bit of tension
mm,
because I think there was maybe, yeah, I mean, sort of a fear of misalignment, and then when you actually took the time to talk through, I mean, I wasn't in the meeting, but from what you shared, that
yeah,
there was already alignment. It wasn't really that the communication solved the alignment. It was just the communication
mm,
sort of dissipated the illusion of misalignment.
yes, yeah, it really highlights the importance of communication. All right, so today we have a new topic, which is that we want to talk about examples of when co-creation does not happen easily. What are the problems with co-creation? Why is it so hard?
Yeah, I think, I mean,
Uh,
it's pretty. I don't know. I mean, we obviously have that in our company in Multiply as kind of the core universal problem, right? Like, why is creating things is together is hard, right? It is hard, and so I'm happy about this topic. Excited to hear what you think.
yes, and we talked about just before that we want to be very practical about
Yeah,
this and highlight real world examples, not only talk about it in a philosophical sense. And so, how about we just start it off? One of us can go with an example of when co creation fell to the ground
sh-
uh, and made a mess instead of something beautiful.
sure. And I mean, I think that we also talked briefly about kind of like there are so many things that can go wrong, right? So and we obviously tried to define co-creation in our last episode, which when you define terms, it's always a bit more philosophical. So I'm happy to dive into kind of one example, and it touches sort of on, I guess, ownership, leadership, that kind of dynamic, um, because sort of the intention in co-creation, right, is that you and I can bring our best to the table for something we do together. And obviously, for me to sort of contribute in a good way, I need some degree of freedom to operate within and make decisions and not be sort of hindered. Um, I think in my first company at Visa, we were I was, at least for the first significant time period, both CEO and head of product, and working with our small but then growing and a bit larger development team. And I think it was very kind of interesting how a dynamic happened where my intention was always to sort of delegate ownership, and then I did that, and then ended up. I mean, I was very very inexperienced at that time leading both product and companies, but like taking it back. So sort of like we deciding on doing something and then giving the autonomy to the development team to build it the way they thought were right, and then coming in and realizing that, wow, we made this really complicated and we built stuff that we really shouldn't be building. one example was that we built our own kind of blogging CMS tool for the website, which obviously wasn't really necessary because there were a bunch of good such ones. But the development team sort of had the motto of how hard can it be, and which I understand. Like, and then they wanted to build it in a certain way so it sort of fitted into our web platform and web product. But then it sort of ended up with us doing that and falling into a kind of spending a lot of time on it. Um, Even though like the development team was stellar, it was really, really great people, and the person leading it was also really, really great, one of my co-founders. But still, we sort of ended up in a situation where we decided we need something. Hey, we need to have a proper blog platform with a bunch of sort of acceptance criteria, and then in the implementation, the freedom of implementation phase, the kind of the way we pursued it was way too complicated, and we spent way too much time. So I sort of think it's quite interesting in that sense, like that co-creation actually needs quite clear boundaries with regards to ownership. And I think, like, just reflecting on myself, there's probably like, you know, there's always several parties in something going wrong usually. But from my point of view, I can see that the boundaries of co-creation, the boundaries of delegating ownership there, and empowering leadership, were not clear enough. For example, you know, time box, kind of what like how much you're actually willing to spend on this, which could then have created better boundaries for development, I think. But of course, it's not that easy. And but that's sort of an example that comes to mind. Do you have anything like similar, or do you have any reflection on that kind of situation?
I can reflect back just so I understand what you're saying, that what went wrong in this situation was where that there was not a clear communication on expectations. Like, this is the time frame. This is what th- uh, this is the minimal feature set, and we decide that upfront, or we actually do the shaping on that upfront. Instead, it was just a iterative process that was prolonged forever.
Yeah, I mean, not forever, luckily, but a
Yeah,
long time, right?
yeah,
It was.
yeah.
So I'm not sure if that would have been the solution. I can just see that the problem that sort of surfaced was that dynamic where, I delegated ownership and
Mm,
then sort of came in after a while and wasn't happy, right? And as sort of,
yeah.
I guess, the manager in the situation, right?
Mm, mm,
Uh, Sort of went in and took back ownership in one sense, like got into the
yeah.
details and removed that autonomy, which was like not a tension that was good. And
Mm,
maybe I was wrong to do that anyhow. But I'm just like, it's interesting how to sort of create the framework for that kind of co-creation to happen,
mm,
without that back and forth. Like where ownership is real, and where
yeah.
ownership is not kind of, because if I give ownership and then take it back, then that basically means that the first ownership was not real, right? I didn't really
Mm,
give ownership. Um,
yeah. And I can mirror by an example from where, when I was the CEO of Twingly, I had we had a multi-year product development process where we started off with thankfully, a very, very basic product that started giving us revenue and gave us a lot of runtime and longevity in the company. And then we did product development on top of that. And one specific example of when co-creation completely failed, was at one time when we had a product idea to explore. Me and um, the product manager at Twingly, we started talking about communication inside organizations. And at that time, this was way back in 2008, probably. And Yammer was like it was a corporate Twitter. I don't know if Yammer is still around, but it was an internal Twitter, like microblog for organizations that had a quick, like 15 seconds of fame, more like probably 18 months of fame around then. And we were exploring, since we were a social media company, we were exploring, are there similar tools, but like taking that idea of internal communication one step ahead. And we came up with um, a solution that was very similar to what Slack is today, for good and bad. And it was so obvious to us, to me and Anton, my product manager, that this was a really great solution. And we wanted to allow the entire company to see that this could be a future product for Twingly, for the entire company. So we brought the team to an offsite at Gotland, a really super beautiful location, at my co-founder's then owned hotel, like beautiful stone building on the countryside with the ocean just a kilometers walk away. And the entire, like, that offsite event was really good, apart from our attempt to co-create this product, where the big failure was that we already had created the vision, and we tried to, like, this is shameful to me to say, to share this, because it's such an obvious failure. We came in with a very firm idea after months of work of what the solution should be.
Mm.
And our way of trying to establish common ground with the rest of the team was to try to steer a co-creation process
Yeah.
into that solution.
Yeah.
And it's such an obvious from the start, uh, failed attempt at co-creation. And we open up the floor to everybody's ideas and held workshops, and people had great ideas. And we just realized, oh shit, what do we do now? Like, they have their own ideas. What do we do? And our attempt, like our really like failed attempt to hide that we already had an idea of what direction we wanted to go, like, that was, still to this day, I cannot talk about this without like having, my entire body is blushing in how shameful this is, that I just attempted to fake a co-creation
Yeah.
workshop, to like, when a proper pitch would have done the job. Like, we already had done the job of coming up with a product formulation. Just pitch that, and then talk from there, instead of faking a clean slate.
Yeah.
That was a really big learning moment for me. So, and so the takeaway is really like, if for true co-creation to happen, everybody should bring everything they have, like, available to the table. They should bring their experience and their skills and their tools and their visions and dreams and hopes. They should not bring an agenda
Yeah.
to steer anyone else. They should not, like, think that they already have the solution. That becomes poisonous to co-creation.
I think it's interesting though, because I really, I think the example is very interesting. I understand like what you mean, because you sort of said, hey, we have a blank slate, let's co-create something within, I don't know, internal messaging. I'm not sure like what the boundary was, but the true boundary was much more narrow.
Yes.
So actually, and I think this is like also with like ownership, because you could have come in with the pitch and said, hey, like this is something we believe a lot in, let's
Yeah.
look at it. And then the frame could have been, hey, we're going to build this, how do we build it the best way? And that could have been the
Yeah.
co-creation, right? So I think it's
Yes.
it's a lot about the boundaries, that if you don't, and I relate back to the example I give as well, if the boundaries are not real, like or clear, so you say you give ownership for something where you're not actually, where ownership is actually not given. In this
Yeah.
case, you didn't give the team ownership of what you wanted to build, because that was already decided. Then that
Yeah.
becomes becomes fake. But it could have been co-creation within just a smaller part of that, right? It could.
Definitely. It was such a missed opportunity. Like the setting was so perfect to have a really great 2 days of like pure co-creation in a state of flow, and we just ruined it with our hidden,
Yeah.
shamefully hidden agenda.
Yeah, and probably not that hidden. Like usually when you think things are
Probably not
hidden,
that hidden at all. It was
probably pretty
probably
obvious.
pretty obvious from the start what the intention was.
Yeah.
So yes, there. And now when we talk about it, I realize that our examples are not that far apart. That it was a failure to really delegate ownership,
Yeah, and
right?
also clarity of which ownership do you delegate? You know,
Yeah,
what is the boundary of co-creation? Because I think
yeah. What
that.
is this the boundary and the starting point? Like where
Mm,
are we right now?
yeah,
What are the fixed? What is fixed and what is open?
yeah,
Clarity on that.
and that's actually something I think is quite interesting. With like, there's a lot of good kind of books and knowledge around leadership and transparency, and I think like transparency around boundaries is so important. For example, if I go back to my example, if I would have been clear, hey, we have this amount of time, this is like, let's agree on this plan, and now you have to do like develop this within this frame, right? And then I would have potentially given co-creation within a clear frame of, say, time or scope or both. And I mean, this is famous in software development. You can't you can't fix cost, time, and scope, right? That's just impossible. But
You get to pick two.
yeah, max two,
Yeah.
in my opinion, max two. One you can definitely pick, and hopefully two. Um, so I think that's like, and I think that's why like transparency in terms of like, hey, this is the time we have, or this is the budget we have, or these are the goals. Where I think you shouldn't try to co-create everything at once, right? So in one sense, you and Anton had already co-created
Mm.
the product to some extent, the product vision at
Yes.
least, and maybe the product strategy. At least whatever you had co-created, it's much easier to fix that frame. And maybe there were fixed boundaries as well. Hey, we have to spend 80% of our time on the Twingly core product. We only have
Mm.
this much time to spend, or we only have this many people to spend, on this, or this much money, or whatever it is. Um, or maybe it was a first customer that would have been able to use it. I don't know, like what the fixed boundaries would have been in your example, but I think that's something where I at least feel, and I have other examples on that, is that a misunderstanding of the boundary and like an over ambition in how
Mm.
much you want to co-create, like what you want to co-create, actually
Mm.
just renders co-creation completely useless. And this is like where it becomes kind of a hippie thing that you open up everything, and then you co-create, and that's great if you have no frame for what result you want. But if you have a frame, like a boundary for either what result you want, or limitations like of what resources you have, or whatever like that, then I think being clear
Which
on that.
almost always exists in a
Yeah,
corporate or a company setting.
yeah, yeah, or even like in a in something private, maybe have a fixed amount of time to
Yeah.
to put into it. I mean, you're at least a
Mm.
fixed number of people. It's not an infinite number of people. So there's
Mm.
definitely some fixed resource in terms of time.
Yeah.
Um, and there are also, I think that's something that I hadn't really sort of thought about that much before. I mean, maybe previously, but not before we started talking today. Is kind of that ownership and boundaries are the same thing. Like, ownership
Mm.
needs boundaries. There is nothing such as like complete co-creation, or like perfect co-creation, in terms of that there are unlimited
Mm.
degrees of freedom. There are always, if you look at mathematically, you know you have some fixed parameters to navigate around or to operate
Mm.
within.
Mm. I also what comes up in me now is a different kind of ownership as well, which is to own the problem.
Mhm.
Once the problem in co-creation has appeared, if me and Anton, after the first 2 hours of those 2 days, when we started to realize that holy shit, something is this, how is this going to work? If we would just own that problem and said it to the
Mhm.
entire team, wow, we came into this with a completely wrong idea of what
Mhm.
was going to happen. Can we just start over?
Yeah,
or can we, like, where do we go from here? Just sit
Mm.
down and have an honest, let's sit down and
Mm.
have an honest discussion about what's happening here.
Mm.
We obviously uh, are trying to do something that will not work,
Mm.
and own that problem. And I wonder if do you have a sense in your example, when you started realize that we haven't set the boundaries that were needed, could you have, instead of then coming in and taking back ownership, is there a way you could have sort of asked to have the ownership back first and explained, or like, is there a different approach that could have solved the problem even though the problem was already there?
Yeah, I think that comes down back to boundaries, right? If you failed to establish boundaries, then you need to own that and reestablish boundaries so that it doesn't become taking back ownership. It becomes clarifying ownership and therefore making it more real. And I mean, when you do something together, you always learn things and new boundaries surface. And I mean, if we take software development, it's not like a developer has perfect information before they start building something. It's really hard. Everyone knows that who's in the business to time estimate anything. So I think that comes back again to like if you realize that boundaries are not clear enough or wrong, then that should be established. And that's also why I think, like for example, what we've been doing recently in Multiply is actually establishing platform principles and product principles. It's like a boundary, and even like process principles, such as if there is something good solving this out there that we don't have to build ourselves, we should use it. That's like a principle that means that the first part of any project becomes to look at what's out there and is there any kind of API or third party solution that we can use for this.
Or expertise to bring in.
Expertise, definitely,
Yeah.
definitely. So I think it's almost like to have co-creation, say with a fixed group of people like in a company like in ours, then having principles becomes like a very like it's almost like an absolute frame. Then you can change them, of course, right, as you learn, but just having that absolute frame gives the boundaries for co-creation, just as in a project, designing the boundaries of something we're going to do, or in a role in an organization, why role descriptions are very helpful if you do them right in co-creation, and where a process can be very helpful in co-creation is because it's a frame. And that doesn't mean the frame is perfect, which we can get into. You probably need to update it continuously, just like to more or less, depending on what kind of level the boundaries are on. But I think that's what I sort of, at least for me, comes up as a big learning, that it is easy to miss establishing clear boundaries of ownership slash leadership, and therefore hindering co-creation or making co-creation fake. And if something becomes fake, then people don't trust it. People don't like, that's like, I'm a leader. If we've both been CEOs a lot. Like I'm a CEO, which means I'm sort of, I don't know, in one sense above, like, if I say, oh, we're going to co-create this, and then it's not real. I mean, people shouldn't really trust what I say after that, right? So I think it's really become owning the mistake as a leader, to set boundaries, re-establishing
Mm,
boundaries, and having a discussion around boundaries for co-creation slash ownership.
mm. There's a really excellent book, I think it's called Extreme Ownership, about the where the author claims to, at least to rightfully portray an ownership culture which exists, within the Navy SEALs
Mm,
in the US, where there's a culture of, according to the author, of taking responsibility. Maybe it's even extreme responsibility or something, like,
mm,
which is the title of the book. Where we can put this in the notes later. Where they have a culture of everyone in the team immediately standing up and taking ownership of mistakes
mm,
that have been made, which and it's such an extremely more positive way of initiating a discussion about what went wrong. If two people that have a learning opportunity both say, I did something wrong. No, this was me doing something wrong,
Yeah,
rather than say
yeah,
pointing the finger to the other person.
yeah.
It's such a much better, even though maybe you end up in the same way, realizing, yeah, maybe I did not have as much impact on this particular situation as initially try to make it appear. Then, but then the starting point of ownership
Mm.
is so much more positive than pointing the finger to others and said that was you, um,
That's an interesting
doing
quote that
doing
comes
that.
to me. Like there's this historically enlightened person called Atisha, who says, "Point all blame to yourself." That's the starting point. I think it was Atisha at least. And I think what's the interesting thing about that approach in co-creation and doing something together is, like you say, if we start with that, then usually we are blaming ourselves too much, which is good because then that surfaces and we don't have to carry that unnecessary weight because it's a thing we do together, right?
Yes.
Um, but then also, like, it's interesting just coming back to kind of this a bit more philosophical, and I mentioned this in the first episode as well, the book Reinventing Organization by Frederick Laloux, which I come back to a lot.
Hmm.
And he has this
Yeah.
term called evolutionary purpose, which means that if you have a truly, like, this might be in theory, right? But if you have a truly co-creative organization, he doesn't use co-creation, right? But he uses other terms that I think are very synonymous. It's that even the purpose of what you're doing is up for discussion. Even that is allowed to evolve, which might not be true at every stage, right? It's not like let's not like you need to separate strategy and tactics. Some smart people think. I think maybe it was the Nike founder who said this, that you can't discuss strategy in every meeting. But if you're thinking like theoretically, at least in my view, on a co-creative organization, then even the purpose of it is up for discussion at some point. In some situations, even that is allowed to evolve, which I think is the ultimate boundary of doing something together. Is the purpose, the why of doing something together,
Mm.
and if even that is allowed to evolve, then that is a truly kind of co-creative organization. Which actually, the example I think I gave in the first episode is why I'm quite proud of how we've been building Multiply. That the kind of, I mean, I guess the purpose has stayed relatively, on a very high level, relatively similar to when we started out, but the actual kind of vision of the product and the company has evolved a lot and been a really co-creative process.
Yes. I
But
think
yeah,
that's a great note to end this episode on. We've been talking
sure.
about boundaries and the importance of ownership, establishing a clear starting point and frame for co creation. Do you have a reflection or conclusion to bring up before we close out?
What came to me, I think, which is kind of the not the flip side, but the other side of ownership, which is leadership. And I think this might be a different episode. A lot of people who have been exploring co-creation talk about self-leadership. You know, co-creation being a way to enable more leadership, not less. It's not like a misunderstanding is, oh, we have no leaders, right? There's no leadership.
Mm.
Actually, co-creation is a frame where there's more leadership. And I think that's just something I think I would love us to explore in another episode because, of course, ownership is earned, in my opinion, and ownership is earned by leadership. So I think that's like the two sides of this, especially since usually in an organization there's some level of decision making hierarchy,
Mm.
from the shareholders board and down, some on some in some way. And I just think that's an interesting dynamic where the ultimate thing is that whoever is in the organization earns leadership, and whoever has the ability can reward that leadership by, or reciprocate that leadership by delegating ownership. So I think
Mm.
that's like a really interesting dynamic that I think we should explore in another episode, but that I wanted to sort of mention now. Do you have any last
Awesome.
reflections?
I think this notion of boundaries was really helpful for me to summarize these points, working from both of our examples and look at what went wrong. Was a good learning moment for me to reiterate that.
Yeah, me too.
Thank you so much for this conversation, Rasmus.
Yeah, thanks, Martin.
Looking forward
And
to next week.
yeah, me too.
And thanks to all our listeners. Tune in for next episode about other problems in co-creation.